state your full name, please? Will you repeat this oath after me? I swear by God, the Almighty and Omniscient, that I will speak the pure truth and will withhold and add nothing. We must sit down.
Albert Speer was born in Mannheim into an upper-middle-class family. He was the second of 3 sons of Albert and Louise Speer. Speer followed in the footsteps of his grandfather and of his father and studied architecture. He was an impressive student and began his architectural studies at the University of Karlsruhe. He then moved to the Technical University of Munich and finally on to the Technical University of Berlin, where he studied under Heinrich Tassenau. After passing his exams in 1927, Speer became Tassenau's assistant, a high honour for a man of just 22 years of age.
Speer was a very active man. He played his part in various sports. He took up skiing and mountaineering. But his Heidelberg school preferred rugby football to soccer, which was unusual in Germany, and Speer was a keen participant. Rugby was viewed as an upper-class game, and Speer's family were great snobs, so this fitted in with their highly class-conscious thinking. As far as we can tell, Speer was a second-row forward.
In mid-1922, Speer began courting Margaret Weber, the daughter of a successful craftsman who employed 50 workers. The relationship was frowned upon by Speer's class-conscious mother, who felt that Webers were socially inferior. Despite this opposition, the two married in Berlin on the 28th of August 1928. It was 8 years before Margaret was welcome into the Speer family home.
Speer claimed he was apolitical when he was a young man, and that he attended a Nazi Berlin rally in December 1930 only at the urging of some of his students. Nonetheless, it seems to have had an impact. From the 1st of March 1931, he joined the Nazi Party and became member number 474481. In 1931, Speer surrendered his position to Tassenau's assistant and moved to Mannheim. His father gave him a job as a manager of the family properties, and in July 1932, the Speers visited Berlin to help out the party prior to the Reichstag elections. While they were there, the young architect was recommended to Goebbels as the ideal man to oversee the renovations of the party's Berlin headquarters. Speer agreed to do the work, and the results found such favour that the organisers asked Speer to submit designs for the 1933 Nuremberg Rally.
Aus den Fabriken und Stuben folgt unseres Banners Zug. Aus den Fabriken und Stuben folgt unseres Banners Zug. Werden Gauner und Schieber ächten das Vaterland. Wir wollen ehrlich verdienen, fleißig mit schaffender Hand. Wir wollen ehrlich verdienen, fleißig mit schaffender Hand. Hitler ist unser Führer, ihn lohnt nicht goldener Sold. Der von den jüdischen Thronen vor seine Füße rollt. Der von den jüdischen Thronen vor seine Füße rollt. Einst kommt der Tag der Rache, einmal werden wir frei. Schaffendes Deutschland erwache.
Speer's work on the party rally brought him into contact with Hitler for the first time. And Hitler appreciated the spectacle Speer had created and won Speer his first national post as Nazi Party Commissioner for the Artistic and Technical Presentation of Party Rallies and Demonstrations. Hitler was fascinated by architecture, and Speer's next major assignment was as liaison to the Berlin building trades for Paul Trust's renovation of the Reich Chancellery. As Chancellor, Hitler had a residence in the building and came by every day to be briefed by Speer and the building supervisors on the progress of the renovations. After one of these briefings, Hitler invited Speer to lunch, to the architect's great excitement. Hitler showed considerable interest in Speer during the luncheon and later told Speer that he had been looking for a young architect capable of carrying out his architectural dreams for the new Germany. Speer quickly became part of Hitler's inner circle. He was expected to call on Hitler in the morning for a walk or a chat, to provide consultation on architectural matters and to discuss Hitler's ideas. Most days he was invited to dinner.
The two men found much in common. Hitler spoke of Speer as a kindred spirit for whom he had always maintained the warmest human feelings. The young, ambitious architect was dazzled by his rapid rise and close proximity to Hitler, which guaranteed him a flood of commissions from the government and from the highest ranks of the party. Speer testified at Nuremberg, "I belonged to a circle which consisted of other artists and his personal staff. If Hitler had any friends at all, I certainly would have been one of his close friends."
When Trust died on January the 21st, 1934, Speer effectively replaced him as the party's chief architect. Hitler appointed Speer as head of the Chief Office of Construction. One of Speer's first commissions after Trust's death was the Zeppelin Field Stadium, the Nuremberg parade grounds. These titanic structures can be seen in Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda masterpiece, Triumph of the Will.
Meine deutsche Jugend, nach einem Jahr kann ich euch hier wieder begrüßen. Ihr seid heute hier in dieser Muschel nur ein Ausschnitt dessen, was außer ihr über ganz Deutschland steht. Und wir möchten nun, dass ihr, deutsche Jungs und deutsche Mädchen, in euch all das aufnehmt, was wir dereinst uns von Deutschland hoffen. Wir wollen ein Volk sein. Und ihr, meine Jugend, sollt dieses Volk nun werden. Wir wollen einst keine Klassen und Stände mehr sehen. Und ihr dürft sie in euch schon nicht mehr groß werden lassen. Wir wollen einst ein Reich sehen. Und ihr müsst euch schon dafür erziehen. Wir wollen, dass dieses Volk einst gehorsam ist. Und ihr müsst euch in dem Gehorsam üben. Wir wollen, dass dieses Volk einst friedliebend und aber auch tapfer ist. Und ihr müsst friedfertig sein.
This huge area was able to hold 340,000 people. The Tribune was influenced by the Pergamon altar at Anatolia, but was magnified to an enormous scale.
SA und SS-Männer. Vor wenigen Monaten hat sich über der Bewegung ein schwarzer Schatten erhoben. Die SA hat so wenig als irgendeine andere Institution der Partei mit diesen Schatten etwas zu tun. Sie täuschen sich alle, die glauben, dass auch nur ein Riss in das Gefüge unserer einzigen Bewegung gekommen sei. Sie steht fest, so wie dieser Block hier. Und sie wird in Deutschland durch nichts zerbrochen. Und wenn jemand sich am Geiste meiner SA versündigt, dann trifft das nicht diese SA, sondern nur diejenigen selbst, die es wagen, sich an ihr zu versündigen. Und nur ein Wahnsinniger oder ein bewusster Lügner kann denken, dass ich oder irgendjemand jemals die Absicht hätten, das aufzulösen, was wir selbst in langen Jahren aufgebaut haben. Nein, meine Kameraden, wir stehen fest zusammen für unser Deutschland und wir müssen fest zusammenstehen für dieses Deutschland. Ich übergebe euch dann die neuen Feldzeichen in der Überzeugung, dass ich sie in die treuesten Hände gebe, die es in Deutschland gibt. Denn in den Zeiten hinter uns, da habt ihr mir eure Treue tausendfältig bewiesen. Und in der Zeit vor uns kann es nicht anders sein und es wird auch nicht anders sein. Und so grüße ich euch denn als meine alten, treuen S-Männer. Sieg heil!
Speer insisted that as many events as possible be held at night, both to give greater prominence to his lighting effects and to hide the individual Nazis, many of whom were overweight. Speer again surrounded the site with 130 anti-aircraft searchlights and described this as his most beautiful work, the only one that stood the test of time.
Speer decided a breathtaking idea was required, and he came up with the astonishing concept of the Cathedral of Light. This was a huge array of searchlights which projected up into the night sky like the pillars of a vast cathedral. And this framed the huge parade ground, and it produced the impression that the party members were gathered together in one huge hall like the gods in Valhalla. It actually used all of the searchlights which the Luftwaffe then had available. But the grand spectacle it produced was a huge success, and it was seen as a powerful symbol of the new Germany.
Prior to Speer's appointment, Werner March had been commissioned to design for the Olympic Stadium for the 1936 Summer Olympics. Hitler disliked the March design as too modern. Speer modified the plans and added the necessary backward-looking link by adding a stone exterior. Hitler was delighted with the retro feel, and it was to prove another feather in Speer's cap. Speer also designed the German pavilion for the 1937 International Exposition in Paris. The German and Soviet pavilion sites were opposite each other, and on learning, through a clandestine look at the Soviet plans, that the Soviet design included two colossal figures, seemingly about to overrun the German site, Speer modified his design to include a cubic mass which would check their advance, with a huge eagle on top looking down on the Soviet figures. And in 1937, Hitler appointed Speer as General Building Inspector for the Reich capital, with the rank of Under-Secretary of State in the Reich government. The position carried with it extraordinary powers over the Berlin city government and made Speer answerable to Hitler alone. It also made Speer a member of the Reichstag, though the body by then had little effective power.
Hitler ordered Speer to develop plans to rebuild Berlin so it became the finest and most imposing city in Europe. The plans centred on a 3-mile-long grand boulevard running from north to south, which Speer called the Prachtstrasse, or Street of Magnificence.
At the northern end of the boulevard, Speer planned to build the Volkshalle, a huge assembly hall with a dome which would have been over 700 feet high, with floor space for 180,000 people. At the southern end of the avenue, it was planned a great triumphal arch, which would be almost 400 feet high and be able to fit the Arc de Triomphe inside its opening.
The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 led to the postponement and later the abandonment of the plans for the new Berlin. But architecture was Hitler's real passion, and not surprisingly, he envisaged a city built on a staggering scale. We get an idea of the megalomaniac scale of the vision from the fact that when Speer's father saw the model for the new Berlin, he said to his son, "You have all gone completely insane." And I think that sums up the real essence of what the Third Reich really was all about.
In January 1938, Hitler asked Speer to build a new Reichschancellery on the same site as the existing structure, and said he needed it for urgent foreign policy reasons, no later than his next New Year's reception for diplomats on the 10th of January 1939. This was a huge undertaking, especially as existing chancellery was in full operation. However, Speer was successful in building the large, impressive structure in just 9 months. The structure included a marble gallery, 146 meters long, almost twice the length of the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. Speer employed thousands of workers in 2 shifts. Hitler, who had remained away from the project, was overwhelmed when Speer presented it, fully furnished, 2 days earlier. In appreciation for the architect's work on the chancellery, Hitler awarded Speer the Nazi Golden Party Badge.
Despite all his success, Speer was under significant psychological pressure during this period of his life, which would lead to panic attacks. Soon after Hitler had given him the first large architectural commissions, Speer began to suffer from anxiety in long tunnels, in airplanes or in small rooms. His heart would begin to race and he would become breathless, and he would get the impression that his blood pressure was rising tremendously.
Speer supported the German invasion of Poland and subsequent war, even though he recognized that it would lead to the postponement, at the least, of his architectural dreams.
In his later years, Speer explained how he felt in 1939. He stated that he was perfectly aware that Hitler sought world domination. And that was fine by Speer, as the whole point of his buildings was to celebrate an expanded German empire. Speer acknowledged that his proposed buildings would have looked incongruous if Hitler had simply sat still in Germany as an ordinary politician. All he wanted was that for this great man to dominate the globe so that his buildings were actually seen to celebrate and reflect an all-conquering regime.
Speer placed his department at the disposal of the Wehrmacht, and among Speer's innovations were quick reaction squads to construct roads or clear away debris. Of course, before long, these units would be used to clear bomb sites. Now, as the war progressed, initially there were great German successes to celebrate, and Hitler insisted that Speer should join him on his historic visit to Paris. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Speer came to doubt, despite Hitler's reassurances that his projects for Berlin would ever be completed. Speer's architectural ambitions became even more remote when on the 8th of February 1942, Minister of Armaments Fritz Todt died in a plane crash shortly after taking off from Hitler's eastern headquarters at Rastenburg. On hearing of Todt's death, Hermann Göring raced to Hitler's headquarters, hoping to claim Todt's powers. However, he was to be disappointed when Hitler instead presented Göring with an unexpected fait accompli. Hitler had already appointed Speer as Todt's successor to all of his posts. Speer was reluctant to take up the offer of ministerial office and only did so because Hitler commanded it.
Speer soon discovered that the German economy, even 3 years into the war, was still not fully geared for war production. Consumer goods were still being produced at nearly as high a level as during peacetime, and no fewer than 5 supreme authorities had jurisdiction over armament production, one of which was the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And they had declared in November 1941 that conditions did not permit an increase in armament production. Very few women, for example, were employed in the factories, most of which were running only one shift. And one evening, soon after his appointment, Speer went to visit a Berlin armament factory, and he found that there was no one on the premises whatsoever.
Speer overcame these difficulties by centralizing power over the war economy in himself. Factories were given autonomy, or as Speer put it, self-responsibility. And each factory concentrated on a single product. Backed by Hitler's strong support, the dictator stated, "Speer, I'll sign anything that comes from you." He divided the armament field according to weapon systems, with experts rather than civil servants overseeing each department. No department head could be older than 55, anyone older being susceptible to routine and arrogance, and no deputy older than 40. Presiding over these departments was a central planning committee headed by Speer, which took increasing responsibility for war production, and as time went by, for the German economy itself. According to the minutes of a conference at Wehrmacht High Command in March 1942, it is only Speer's word that counts nowadays. He can interfere in all departments. Already he overrides all departments. On the whole, Speer's attitude is to the point. Goebbels noted in his diary in June 1943, "Speer is still tops with the Führer. He is truly a genius with organization." Speer was so successful in his position that by late 1943 he was widely regarded among the Nazi elite as a possible successor to Hitler.
While Speer had tremendous power, he was of course subordinate to Hitler. Nazi officials sometimes went around Speer by seeking direct orders from the dictator. When Speer ordered peacetime building work suspended, the Gauleiters obtained an exemption for their pet projects. When Speer sought the appointment of Hanke as Labour Czar to optimize the use of German labour, Hitler, under the influence of Martin Bormann, instead appointed Fritz Sauckel, rather than increasing female labour and taking other steps to better organise German labour, as Speer favoured. Sauckel advocated importing labour from the occupied nations and did so obtaining workers for, among other things, Speer's armament factories, using the most brutal methods.
On December the 10th, 1943, Speer visited the underground Mittelwerk V2 rocket factory that used concentration camp labour. Speer later claimed to have been shocked by the conditions there. 6% of the workforce had actually died that month alone from overwork, disease and malnourishment.
Understandably, because of the terrible fate that befell the Jewish people during the Second World War, we often overlook the fact that terrible things happened to civilian populations in France, Belgium, Holland and Denmark, who were literally kidnapped and forced into slave labour. Speer had an easy ride to a large extent from posterity. However, he was well aware where so much of his labour came from. They weren't just the Jews, there were thousands upon thousands of ordinary men and women from all over Europe who were forced into slavery, and the conditions they laboured under were the most terrible conditions imaginable. The V-2 rockets, for example, were produced underground by people who were slowly starving to death, and Speer was ultimately responsible for the use of that labour.
By 1943, the Allies had gained air superiority over Germany, and bombings of German cities and industries had become commonplace. However, the Allies in their strategic bombing campaign did not concentrate on industry. Speer, with his improvisational skills, was able to overcome any losses gained from bombing.
In spite of the bombing campaign, German production of tanks more than doubled in 1943. Production of planes increased by 80%, and production time for one of the Kriegsmarine's submarines was reduced from 1 year to 2 months. Production would continue to increase until the second half of 1944, by which time enough equipment to supply 270 army divisions was being produced, although the Wehrmacht had only 150 divisions in the field.
In January 1944, Speer fell ill with complications from an inflamed knee and was away from his office for 3 months. During his absence, his political rivals, mainly Goering and Martin Bormann, attempted to have some of his powers permanently transferred to them. According to Speer, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler tried to have him physically isolated by having Himmler's personal physician, Karl Gebhardt, treat him, though his care did not improve his health. Speer's wife and friends managed to have his case transferred to his friend Karl Brandt, and he slowly recovered. Nonetheless, in April 1944, Speer's rivals for power succeeded in having him deprived of responsibility for construction, and Speer promptly sent Hitler a bitter letter, concluding with an offer of his resignation. Judging Speer indispensable to the war effort, Field Marshal Erhard Milch persuaded Hitler to try to get his minister to reconsider. Hitler sent Milch to Speer with a message not addressing the dispute, but instead stating that he still regarded Speer as highly as ever. According to Milch, upon hearing the message, Speer burst out, "The Führer can kiss my ass." After a lengthy argument, Milch persuaded Speer to withdraw his offer of resignation on the condition that his powers were restored.
On 23rd of April 1944, Speer went to see Hitler, who agreed that everything would stay as it was, and Speer would remain the head of all German construction. According to Speer, while he was successful in this debate, Hitler had also won, because he wanted and needed him in his corner. And that's exactly what Speer said Hitler got. In the July 1944 bomb plot to assassinate Hitler, Speer's name was included by the plotters on the list of potential members of a post-Hitler government which was drawn up by the conspirators behind the move to kill Hitler. The list, fortunately for Speer, had a question mark and the annotation "to be won over." And it was probably this that actually saved Speer from becoming involved in the extensive purges that followed the bomb plot's failure.
Operations Room, Hitler's headquarters, following the attempt on the Führer's life. Conjecture runs high as to whether in fact he did escape at the time or succumbed later to his injuries. These are the German newsreel pictures put out to dispel rumour in the Reich. Rumour which, if anything, has grown over the weeks of his continued silence. According to Goebbels, everyone at the conference, with the exception of General Korten and the Führer, was blown out of the windows by the bomb. A black-cloaked Hitler stands on the platform to welcome the deflated Duce. From beneath concealing folds, he extends his left hand in greeting. Marvellous how he got away with such minor injury and shock. In the chain of events is the visit by Hitler to the hospital where severely injured Nazi notables lie in bandages and tannic acid. Significant that they were personal spies of the Führer, used to watch the German High Command. Swapping injuries at the bedside, Hitler implies what a wonderful recovery he's made.
By February 1945, Speer, who had long concluded that the war was lost, was working to supply areas about to be occupied with food and materials to get them through the hard times ahead. On March 19th, 1945, Hitler issued his Nero decree ordering a scorched earth policy in both Germany and the occupied territories. Hitler's order, by its terms, deprived Speer of any power to interfere with the decree, and Speer went to confront Hitler, telling him that he was lost, that the war was lost. Hitler gave Speer 24 hours to reconsider his position, and when the two met the following day, Speer answered, "I stand unconditionally behind you." However, he demanded the exclusive power to implement the Nero decree, and Hitler signed an order to that effect. Using this order, Speer worked to persuade generals and Gauleiters to circumvent the Nero decree and avoid needless destruction of industry that would be needed after the war. Speer managed to reach a relatively safe area near Hamburg as the Nazi regime finally collapsed, but decided on a final risky visit to Berlin to see Hitler one more time. Speer stated at Nuremberg, "I felt that it was my duty not to run away like a coward, but to stand up to him again." Speer visited the Führer bunker on the 22nd of April 1945. Hitler seemed calm and somewhat distracted, and the two had a long, disjointed conversation in which the dictator defended his actions and informed Speer of his intent to commit suicide and have his body burned.
In the published edition of Inside the Third Reich, Speer relates that he confessed to Hitler that he had actually defied the so-called Nero decree, but he also states that he then assured Hitler of his personal loyalty, and that this assurance brought tears to Hitler's eyes. I think that's a highly dubious passage, and it seems out of character for Hitler, especially when we consider that the following morning Speer left the Führer bunker to return to Hamburg, and shortly afterwards, on April 29th, the day before he committed suicide, Hitler dictated a final political testament which actually dropped Speer from the successor government. Speer was to be replaced by his own subordinate, Karl Otto Sauer.
After Hitler's death, Speer offered his services to the so-called Flensburg government, the short-lived administration headed by Hitler's successor, Karl Dönitz. Speer took a significant role in that short-lived regime, and on the 15th of May, the Americans arrived and asked Speer if he would be willing to provide information on the effects of the air war. Speer agreed, and over the next several days provided information on a broad range of subjects. On the 23rd of May, 2 weeks after the surrender of German troops, the British arrested the members of the Flensburg government and brought Nazi Germany to a formal end. Speer was taken to several internment centres for Nazi officials and interrogated. In September 1945, he was told that he would be tried for war crimes, and several days later he was taken to Nuremberg and incarcerated there. Speer was indicted on all 4 possible counts. First, participating in a common plan or conspiracy for the accomplishment of crime against peace. Second, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression and other crimes against peace. Third, war crimes. And lastly, crimes against humanity.
US Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, the chief US prosecutor at Nuremberg, alleged Speer joined in planning and executing the programme to dragoon prisoners of war and foreign workers into German war industries, which waxed in output while the workers waned in starvation. Speer's attorney, Dr. Hans Fleischner, presented Speer as an artist thrust into political life, who had always remained a non-ideologue, and who had been promised by Hitler that he could return to architecture after the war. During his testimony, Speer accepted responsibility for the Nazi regime's actions.
An observer at the trial, journalist and author William L. Shirer, noted that compared to his confidence, Speer made the most straightforward impression of all, and during the long trial spoke honestly and with no attempt to shirk his responsibility and his guilt. Speer also testified that he had planned to kill Hitler in earlier 1945 by introducing Taban poison gas into the Führerbunker ventilation shaft. He said his efforts were frustrated by the impracticality of Taban and his lack of ready access to a replacement nerve agent, and also by the unexpected construction of a tall chimney that put the air intake out of reach.
Speer stated that his motive was despair at realising that Hitler intended to take the German people down with him. Speer's supposed assassination plan subsequently has obviously met with some scepticism, particularly Speer's architectural rival, Hermann Giesler, who sneered that here we have the second most powerful man in the state, and he didn't even have a ladder.
Herr Präsident, meine Herren Richter. Hitler und der Zusammenbruch seines Systems haben eine ungeheure Leidenszeit über das deutsche Volk gebracht. Die nutzlose Fortsetzung dieses Krieges und die unnötigen Zerstörungen erschweren den Wiederaufbau. Entbehrungen und Elend sind über das deutsche Volk gekommen. Es wird nach diesem Prozess Hitler als den erwiesenen Urheber seines Unglücks verachten und verdammen. Die Welt aber wird aus dem Geschehen lernen, die Diktatur als Staatsform nicht nur zu hassen, sondern zu fürchten. Was bedeutet mein eigenes Schicksal nach allem, was geschehen und bei einem solch hohen Ziel? Das deutsche Volk hat in früheren Jahrhunderten viel zu dem Aufbau menschlicher Kultur beigetragen. Es hat diese Beiträge oft in Zeiten geliefert, in denen es genauso ohnmächtig und hilflos war wie heute. Wertvolle Menschen lassen sich nicht zur Verzweiflung treiben. Ein Volk aber, das an seine Zukunft glaubt, wird nicht untergehen. Gott schütze Deutschland und die abendländische Kultur.
On the 1st of October 1946, Speer was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. While 3 of the 8 judges, 2 Soviet and 1 American, initially advocated the death penalty for Speer, the other judges did not. And a compromise sentence was reached. After 2 days' discussion and some rather bitter horse trading, the court's judgment stated as follows. In the closing stages of the war, Speer was one of the few men who had the courage to tell Hitler that the war was lost and to take steps to prevent the senseless destruction of production facilities both in occupied territories and in Germany. He carried out his opposition to Hitler's scorched earth program by deliberately sabotaging it at considerable personal risk. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death and 3 acquitted. Only 7 of the defendants were sentenced to imprisonment, and they remained in the cells at Nuremberg as the Allies debated where and under what conditions they should be incarcerated. On July the 18th, 1947, Speer and his 6 fellow prisoners, all former high officials of the Nazi regime, were flown from Nuremberg to Berlin under heavy guard. The prisoners were taken to Spandau prison in the British sector of what would become West Berlin, where they would be designated by number, with Speer given number 5. Speer considered himself an outcast among his fellow prisoners for his acceptance of responsibility at Nuremberg. Initially, the prisoners were kept in solitary confinement for all but half an hour a day and were not permitted to address each other or their guards. The 4 occupying powers took overall control on a monthly rotation, and as time passed, the strict regime was relaxed, especially during the 3 months in 4 that the 3 Western powers were in control. Speer made a deliberate effort to make a productive use of his time as possible. The prisoners were forbidden to write memoirs, and mail was severely limited and censored. However, as a result of an offer from a sympathetic orderly, Speer was able to have his writings, which eventually amounted to 20,000 sheets, smuggled out of the prison. By 1954, Speer had completed his memoirs, which became the basis of Inside the Third Reich. He was also able to send letters and financial instructions and to obtain writing paper and letters from the outside. His many letters to his children, all secretly transmitted, eventually formed the basis for Spandau, the secret diaries.
With the draft memoir complete and clandestinely transmitted, Speer sought a new project. He found one while taking his daily exercise, walking in circles around the prison yard. Measuring the path's distance carefully, Speer set out to walk the distance from Berlin to Heidelberg. He then expanded his idea into a worldwide journey, visualizing the places he was travelling through while walking the path around the prison yard. Speer ordered guidebooks and other materials about the nations through which he imagined he was passing, so as to envisage an accurate picture as possible, meticulously calculating every metre travelled and mapping distances to the real-world geography. He began in northern Germany, passed through Asia by a southern route before entering Siberia, then crossed the Bering Strait and continued southwards, finally ending his sentence 35 kilometres, about 22 miles, south of Guadalajara, Mexico.
Speer devoted much of his time and energy to reading. Speer was a voracious reader, and he completed well over 500 books in the first 3 years at Spandau alone. He read classic novels, travelogues, books on ancient Egypt and biographies of such figures as Lucas, Cranach, Edouard Manet and Genghis Khan. Speer took to the prison garden for enjoyment. He was allowed to build an ambitious green, transforming what he initially described as a wilderness into what the American commander at Spandau described as Speer's Garden of Eden.
Speer's supporters maintained a continual call for his release, but a reduced sentence required the consent of all 4 of the occupying powers, and the Soviets adamantly refused any such proposal. So in the end, Speer served his full sentence and was released on the stroke of midnight, 1st of October 1966.
Speer's release from prison was a worldwide media event, as reporters and photographers crowded both the streets outside Spandau and the lobby of the Berlin Hotel, where Speer spent his first hours of freedom in over 20 years. He said little, reserving his comments for a major interview published in Der Spiegel in November 1966, in which he again took personal responsibility for crimes of the Nazi regime. Abandoning plans to return to architecture, 2 proposed partners died shortly after his release. He revised his Spandau writings into 2 autobiographical books, and later researched and published a 3rd work about Himmler and the SS. His books, most notably Inside the Third Reich and Spandau, the Secret Diaries, provide a unique and personal look into the personalities of the Nazi era and have become much valued by historians.
Speer found himself unable to re-establish his relationship with his children, even with his son Albert, who had also become an architect. According to Speer's daughter Hilda, one by one my sister and brothers gave up. There was no communication. Following the publication of his best-selling books, Speer donated a considerable amount of money to Jewish charities. According to Sidler, these donations were as high as 80% of his royalties. Speer kept the donations anonymous, both for fear of rejection and for fear of being called a hypocrite.